We're continuing looking at ways to make mortise and tenons with power tools, and in this episode we'll take a closer look at using a dado stack to make tenons. Of all the ways to make tenons, I think using a table saw and dado stack is my favourite. And yes, I know that dado stacks are illegal in the UK. And yes, I know that they're technically not illegal, and it's to do with the spin down times as outlined in the Pure 98 legislation. Links below for that. To make tenons with a dado stack, you'll need a table saw, a dado stack, and either a sled or miter gauge. Pretty basic stuff. If you have a table saw, good chances you'll have the rest. What about those in the UK or those who don't want to buy a dado stack? Well, you can do the exact same process with a regular blade. It'll just be slower. I'll cover the router table methods in a future video. You don't need a particularly wide dado stack either. I tend to set up about a 12mm wide stack. You're removing material so quickly that unless you're doing dozens to maybe hundreds of these in one shot, you're not going to gain any huge time savings from it. As for the sled or miter gauge, it's really up to you. Personally, I prefer the crosscut sleds because the gauge that came with my saw was absolute garbage. I threw that in the bin and I've been inclined to use sleds ever since. They're cheaper and they're easier to build. The two main advantages of a sled for this sort of thing is the workpiece sits on top of the sled, which means there's reduced friction, which results in reduced chance of deflection and any wiggle of the piece that you're adding a tenon to. However, the main advantage is having zero clearance, resulting in cleaner cuts. This is both the back fence and underneath the tenon. Miter gauges, however, are much better if you need to have an angled tenon. What makes the table saw and dado stack great for tenon cutting is the speed and repeatability. It's a little bit slower setup than a router table, but once you've dialed it in, each tenon is super fast to cut. Because you're able to use positive stops that don't require clamping or unclamping, this is much more accurate and much faster than the plunge router method, and it scales much better than the router table method, which tends to be better for smaller stock. The first thing to get out of the way is mortise first or tenon first. The answer is mortise, always mortise. If you only have to do one pass with the plunge router, that's always better. If you're unfamiliar with a dado stack, this is going to be a very confusing video, so we should go over that first. A dado stack is, as the name implies, a stack of blades that are used to primarily cut dados. They replace a normal table saw blade when you want to quickly remove a lot of material, like when you're cutting a dado or when you're cutting a groove, a rebate. You'll always have the two outside blades, but to increase the width of your dado, you will typically add shims, spacers, more for fine tuning, and chippers. Chippers are generally less mass than the two outside blades, and that's to help your table saw from stopping bogging down. In my case, these chippers only have 2 teeth on them, and I've got, I think, 3 chippers total that will get me up to about 19mm on a cut. One thing to remember is not all table saws will have a long enough arbor to accept a dado stack. A typical blade is 1/8 inch or 3.2mm. When you're making a wider cut that has big chunky blades like this in the middle, you need to have a long enough arbor to support that. On the saw stops, I think it's about 7/8 of an inch maximum, so it's not quite as large as what some of the other table saws can handle. But honestly, that's never been an issue because I typically run no more than a 1/2 inch dado stack at a time. It still removes so much material. You can use a test piece that's the same dimensions as your workpiece, or you can just nibble the first 1 or 2mm off the tenon. If they're not spot on in the actual tenon, it's okay. That's quite a minimal amount of the glue strength anyway. Adjust your blade to be close to the mark lines for the tenon. Remember that any adjustments of the thickness of the tenon are essentially doubled because we flip the tenon and cut both sides. After measuring the depth of my mortise, I can use the zero clearance cut on the MDF backer to set the distance of the stop block clamp to my fence. This sets the tenon length. It's then simply a matter of nibbling away the tenon until I hit the stop block, then flip and repeat on the other side. This can be also used to cut the shoulders off the tenons. For the mortise it will fit into, we know that it isn't even on all sides, so I'm using a bandsaw to trim it and a rasp to round it. This method works super well in combination with the plunge router for the mortises, and it scales from tiny tenons all the way up to large doors, tables and bed frame tenons. Once you've dialed in your blade height and stop block, you can cut tenons all day long without any additional marking out, and they'll all turn out pretty much identical. This is one of the fastest methods and it doesn't need any highly specific tooling. Dado stacks are useful for making, well, dados, and can be bought for about $140 redos. If you feel the need to make a dedicated sled for it, it doesn't need to be anything particularly fancy either, or you can just use your miter gauge. Thanks for watching.